My husband said I was overreacting until I found this in our son's room. 1. I found it on a Tuesday morning while putting away laundry. My son Austin was at school, my husband Nathan at work. The house was quiet except for the hum of the dryer downstairs. I opened Austin's closet to hang up his shirts, and that's when I saw it, hidden behind a stack of board games on the top shelf. A black leather case, expensive looking, with a combination lock. My hands were shaking as I pulled it down. The lock wasn't engaged. Inside was something that made my stomach drop. Adult surveillance equipment, tiny cameras, recording devices, things that had no business being in a 9-year-old's room. I sat on the floor, the case open in my lap, trying to understand what I was looking at. My first thought was that someone had broken in and hidden these things. But the case was too carefully placed, too deliberately concealed behind items Austin never touched. I called Nathan immediately. He answered on the second ring, his voice casual and warm. I told him what I'd found. The line went silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "You're misunderstanding what that is. Not surprise, not confusion, just calm certainty that I was wrong." 2. Nathan came home during his lunch break. He walked into Austin's room, looked at the open case on the bed and sat down beside it with a heavy sigh. He explained that the equipment was for Austin's protection. That our son had been having behavioral issues we needed to monitor. That his child psychologist had recommended discreet observation to identify triggers for his anxiety episodes. The explanation was detailed, specific, and almost convincing. He mentioned Dr. Holloway, a specialist I'd never heard of. He talked about documented sleep disturbances and classroom incidents I knew nothing about. He showed me printouts of emails I'd supposedly been copied on. I felt foolish standing there, holding surveillance equipment like I'd discovered some terrible crime. Nathan's voice was patient, understanding. He wasn't defensive or angry. He seemed relieved I'd found it, like he'd been carrying this burden alone and was glad to finally share it. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him so badly. He took my hand and explained how the psychologist needed behavioral data to make an accurate diagnosis. How Austin's teacher had expressed concerns. How they'd planned to tell me once they had more information. 3. That evening, I made Austin his favorite dinner. Chicken nuggets shaped like dinosaurs, macaroni and cheese, apple slices arranged in a smile. We ate together at the kitchen table while Nathan worked late. I kept the conversation light, asking about school, about his friends, about the book he was reading. Then I mentioned his room casually. Asked if he liked how we'd reorganized his closet last month. Austin looked up from his plate, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. He recited the answer like he'd practiced it. "My room is organized for better focus and reduced anxiety." The exact phrase Nathan had used that afternoon. Not in a 9-year-old's words. In clinical terminology that sounded rehearsed and strange coming from a child who still called the bathroom the potty room. I asked him who taught him that phrase. He said his teacher, Mrs. Palmer. But I'd met Mrs. Palmer at parent-teacher conferences. She was warm and casual, the kind of teacher who said stuff like super cool and awesome job. She would never use words like reduced anxiety with a 3rd grader. 4. What disturbed me most wasn't the equipment. It was Nathan's reaction, or rather his lack of reaction. When I'd called him about finding surveillance devices in our son's room, any normal parent would have been shocked, confused, angry. But Nathan had been calm. Too calm. Like he'd been expecting the call. Like he'd prepared for this exact scenario. I started replaying our conversation in my head. He hadn't asked what was in the case. He hadn't asked where I'd found it or how I'd opened it. He'd simply provided an explanation for equipment I hadn't even described yet. That night, lying in bed beside him, I tested something. I mentioned that I'd moved the case to a different shelf. His hand stopped moving across his phone screen for just a moment. "Which shelf?" he asked, his voice casual but his body suddenly tense. I told him I'd put it in the hall closet. He nodded and went back to his phone. But 15 minutes later, when he thought I was asleep, I heard him get up. Heard him walk down the hall. Heard the closet door open. He was checking. 5. I decided to test how closely Nathan was watching me. The next morning, I made a small change to my routine. Instead of dropping Austin at school and coming straight home, I stopped at the grocery store. Nothing unusual, just a quick trip I hadn't mentioned. When I got home, Nathan was in the kitchen making coffee. "How was the store?" he asked without looking up. I felt my heart skip. I hadn't told him I was going to the store. I'd posted nothing on social media. There were no receipts lying around because I'd paid with cash and left everything in the car. He turned around, and for just a second, I saw something flicker across his face. Realization. He'd revealed something he shouldn't know. Then he smiled and said he'd noticed we were low on milk that morning. The excuse was smooth and reasonable, but we weren't low on milk. The gallon in the fridge was still half full. He was tracking my movements somehow, and he just confirmed it without meaning to. I played along, smiled, said yes. I'd grabbed a few things, but my hands were shaking as I put the coffee cup to my lips. Number 6. I started paying attention to Austin's room in a way I never had before. On Thursday afternoon, while Nathan was at the gym and Austin was at soccer practice, I went through every inch of that space. That's when I noticed something impossible. There was a locked drawer in Austin's desk, a small drawer at the bottom that I'd never seen before. I'd assembled that desk myself when we moved into this house 3 years ago. I'd organized every drawer, labeled every compartment. There had been no locked drawer. I knelt down and examined it closely. The wood was a slightly different shade, like it had been added recently. The lock was small but sophisticated, requiring a specific key, not just a generic furniture key. I tried every key on my keyring. Nothing worked. Later that evening, Nathan came home from the gym. He emptied his pockets onto the kitchen counter like he always did. Wallet, phone, car keys, and a separate keyring I'd never noticed before. 5 small keys, each labeled with a number. He scooped them up quickly and put them in his gym bag before heading to the shower. 7. On Friday night, Nathan took Austin to his parents' house for a sleepover. It was a regular thing, happened twice a month. They wouldn't be home until Sunday afternoon. I had the house to myself for the first time in weeks. I waited until their car was out of the driveway, then went straight to Nathan's gym bag. The keyring was in the inside pocket. I took the keys to Austin's room and tried each one in the locked drawer. The 3rd key worked. Inside the drawer, I found folders, organized, labeled folders with dates going back 6 months. I pulled out the first one and started reading. They were notes, detailed observations about our family, about me, my daily routines, my phone calls, my conversations with friends, times I left the house, places I went, people I talked to. Everything was documented with clinical precision. There were notes about my emotional state, my tone of voice, my body language. Notes about arguments we'd had with exact quotes that I barely remembered saying. And then I saw the letterhead on one of the pages. Holloway Psychiatric Associates. The doctor Nathan had mentioned existed. 8. I spent hours reading through the folders that night. What terrified me most was how the notes reframed everything. Normal moments from our marriage were described as concerning incidents. The time I'd cried during a stressful week at work became evidence of emotional instability. The argument we'd had about his mother visiting became proof of irrational hostility. A conversation where I'd expressed concern about Austin's screen time was documented as obsessive parental anxiety. Every normal human emotion, every reasonable concern, every moment of stress was being recorded and twisted into something pathological. I found notes from 3 months ago, from 6 months ago, from a year ago. Nathan had been documenting me long before he'd mentioned any concerns about Austin. He'd been building a case, piece by piece, creating a narrative that painted me as unstable, unreliable, potentially dangerous. And the most chilling part? Some of the notes referenced recordings. Audio files numbered and dated, stored somewhere I hadn't found yet. He'd been recording me, in our home, in our bedroom, maybe even in the bathroom. I felt violated in a way I'd never experienced before. 9. On Monday morning, I called my friend Chloe. We'd known each other since college, and she was the only person I trusted completely. I didn't tell her everything, just mentioned casually that Nathan had been documenting some things about our family life. The silence on the other end of the line stretched out uncomfortably. Then Chloe asked a question that stopped me cold. Why would he document that? Her voice was careful, concerned. She didn't sound surprised by the behavior. She sounded alarmed by the implications. I tried to brush it off, said it was probably nothing, just some anxiety thing his therapist recommended. But Chloe wasn't buying it. She worked as a family court mediator. She'd seen custody battles turn ugly. She'd watched parents build cases against each other for years before filing for divorce. "That's not anxiety management," she said quietly. "That's evidence gathering. And evidence gathering means someone is planning to use it." The realization hit me like ice water. Nathan wasn't monitoring Austin. He wasn't concerned about our son's behavioral health. He was building a case to prove I was unfit, and he'd been working on it for over a year. 10. I needed to test something. That evening, I told Nathan a lie. A specific, deliberate lie that I could track. I said that I'd talked to my sister about possibly visiting her in Portland next month. Just me and Austin, a week-long trip during spring break. Nathan smiled and said that sounded nice. He asked which dates I was thinking. I gave him fake dates. Dates I'd made up specifically for this test. 2 days later, I checked the folders again while he was at work. There was a new note, dated the day after our conversation. Subject: discussed Portland trip, March 15th through 22. Claimed sister extended invitation. Appears to be planning extended absence with child. No prior discussion with co-parent about removing child from home state. He documented my fake trip. But more than that, he documented it with language designed to sound alarming. Removing child from home state. Like I was planning to kidnap our son. I stood there in Austin's room, holding that note, and I finally understood. Nathan wasn't gathering evidence because he was concerned. He was gathering evidence because he was planning something. And he'd been planning it for a very long time. 11. The realization came to me at 3 in the morning. I was lying awake, staring at the ceiling, when the pieces finally clicked into place. The surveillance equipment wasn't hidden in Austin's room to monitor Austin. It was hidden there because Austin's room was the one place I'd never think to look for equipment monitoring me. The cameras, the recording devices, all of it pointed toward the common areas of our house. Toward the kitchen, the living room, the hallway. Toward places where I spent my time. Austin's room was just the base station. The safe location where Nathan could hide his monitoring equipment and blame it on parental concern if I ever found it. Which meant the behavioral issues, the teacher's concerns, Dr. Holloway's recommendations, all of it was fabricated. There was nothing wrong with Austin. There had never been anything wrong with Austin. My son was just a prop in Nathan's carefully constructed narrative. A reason to justify surveillance. A way to make me doubt my own judgment when I questioned what was happening. I got out of bed quietly and went to check on Austin. He was sleeping peacefully, his dinosaur nightlight casting soft shadows on the wall, and I realized he had no idea he was being used. 12. I found the email by accident. Nathan's laptop was open on the kitchen counter, and when I walked past, the screen lit up with a notification. It was an email draft. Not sent yet, just saved. Addressed to Dr. Holloway with a subject line that made my stomach turn. Patient update, escalating concerns, re-spouse. I should have walked away, should have pretended I'd never seen it. But I clicked on it. The email was a masterpiece of manipulation. Nathan described me as increasingly paranoid, emotionally unstable, showing signs of deteriorating mental health. He claimed I'd been making unfounded accusations against him, behaving erratically, showing potential danger to myself and others. The language was clinical, concerned, written in a way that made him sound like a worried husband seeking professional guidance. The email ended with a request. Nathan asked Dr. Holloway to prepare documentation that might be necessary for intervention. Code words that meant he was planning to have me evaluated, possibly committed, definitely discredited. The date on the email was from 2 weeks ago. He'd been planning this before I'd even found the surveillance equipment. Finding it hadn't triggered his response. It had simply accelerated a timeline that was already in motion. Number 13. I finally understood the full picture. Nathan wasn't building a case for divorce. He was building a case to take everything. To paint me as mentally unfit so he could get full custody of Austin. To destroy my credibility so thoroughly that no one would believe me when I tried to defend myself. The surveillance, the documentation, the false diagnosis, it was all preparation for a legal battle where I would be portrayed as an unstable, paranoid woman who couldn't be trusted with her own child. And the terrifying part was how well it had been planned. He'd started over a year ago, long before I'd noticed anything wrong. He'd created a paper trail with a real psychiatrist, someone who could testify in court about his concerns. He'd documented incidents that looked alarming when taken out of context. He'd isolated me from friends and family without me even realizing it was happening. I thought about the past year. The times he'd suggested I was overreacting, the moments he'd questioned my memory of conversations, the subtle ways he'd made me doubt myself. It was called gaslighting, and I'd been living in it for months without recognizing the signs. 14. I made a decision. Instead of confronting Nathan, instead of reacting emotionally the way his notes predicted I would, I did something different. I became exactly what he expected to see. I started acting calm, agreeable, slightly forgetful. When he came home from work, I smiled and asked about his day. When he mentioned concerns about my behavior, I agreed that maybe I had been stressed lately. When he suggested I should see someone about my anxiety, I nodded and said that sounded like a good idea. I watched him relax. Watched the tension leave his shoulders as he believed his plan was working. He started documenting less frequently because I was behaving exactly as he wanted. The notes became shorter, less detailed. He thought he was winning. What he didn't know was that I was documenting too. Every conversation, every note, every piece of evidence I'd found. I was building my own case. And unlike Nathan, I wasn't planning to use it to destroy someone. I was planning to use it to protect myself and my son. I started sleeping better at night, not because things were better, but because I finally knew what I was dealing with. 15. Nathan made his first mistake during a casual dinner conversation. He was talking about a news article he'd read, something about family law changes in our state. He mentioned specific custody statutes, parental fitness evaluations, how courts determined the best interests of children in contentious situations. The details were too specific, too practiced. He was preparing me, conditioning me to accept that these things happen to other families. Making the language familiar, so when it happened to us, it wouldn't seem shocking. What he didn't know was that I'd spent the last week researching the same topics. I knew exactly what statutes he was referencing. I knew what grounds he'd need to prove parental unfitness. I knew what documentation courts required. And I knew something else. Courts don't like secret surveillance. They especially don't like covert recording of spouses without consent. Nathan had broken laws while trying to build his case against me, and he documented his own illegal activity in those careful notes he thought I'd never see. I smiled and nodded as he talked, letting him think I was absorbing the information innocently. But inside, I was cataloging every word, building my own narrative, one that would hold up better than his. 16. I didn't hire a divorce lawyer. That's what Nathan would expect, and his surveillance would catch it immediately. Instead, I made an appointment with a specialist. Theresa Brooks was a forensic psychologist who consulted on custody cases. She evaluated parents for court proceedings, looking for signs of manipulation, abuse, and parental alienation. I told her everything in our first session. Showed her copies of the notes I'd photographed, described the surveillance equipment, explained the documentation pattern. Theresa listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious as I talked. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then, she said something that changed everything. What you're describing isn't just a custody preparation. It's a specific pattern we see in parental alienation cases. He's not just trying to win custody. He's trying to erase you from your son's life completely. She explained that Nathan's approach was systematic, calculated, designed to isolate Austin from me emotionally before the legal proceedings even started. The coached phrases, the rehearsed responses, the subtle distance I'd noticed, it was all part of a long-term alienation strategy. And the documentation wasn't just for court, it was insurance. A way to discredit anything I might say in my own defense. 17. Theresa helped me understand something crucial. Nathan's documentation revealed more about him than it did about me. The obsessive detail, the clinical language, the year-long surveillance pattern, it all painted a picture of someone with control issues, paranoid tendencies, and a willingness to violate boundaries in disturbing ways. I started my own documentation with Theresa's guidance, but I wasn't documenting behavior. I was documenting strategy. Every time Nathan made a note about me, I documented the context he'd left out. Every concern he raised, I recorded the actual circumstances. Every incident he twisted, I preserved the truth. I documented his surveillance patterns, his recording schedule, his coaching sessions with Austin. I noted times he'd checked his monitoring equipment, conversations where he'd revealed knowledge he shouldn't have, moments where his concerns seemed rehearsed. I wasn't building a case about what was wrong with Nathan. I was building a case about what was wrong with his case. And slowly, a different picture emerged. One where a controlling husband had spent over a year trying to manufacture evidence against his wife, where illegal surveillance had been disguised as parental concern, where a child had been used as a weapon. 18. Nathan finally made his move on a Wednesday evening. He sat me down at the kitchen table with a concerned expression and gentle voice. He said he'd been worried about me for months, that my behavior had become increasingly erratic, that he'd tried to help, but nothing was working. He suggested I take some time away, maybe check into a facility where I could get help. Just for a few weeks, just to rest and recover. He'd already contacted Dr. Holloway, who agreed that a short evaluation period would be beneficial. Austin could stay with him, of course. They'd visit regularly. It would be best for everyone. I looked at my husband across the table and saw a stranger, someone who'd spent over a year systematically destroying my credibility so this exact conversation would seem reasonable. Someone who expected me to comply because I'd been conditioned to doubt myself. Someone who had no idea I'd been preparing for this. I did the last thing he expected. I said no. Not angry, not defensive, just calm and clear. I said I understood his concerns, but I felt fine, and I wouldn't be checking into any facility. His expression flickered. Just for a second, the concerned husband mask slipped, and I saw something cold underneath. 19. The next morning, I went to Austin's room while Nathan was at work. I knew every camera angle, every recording device, every piece of surveillance equipment, and I knew something Nathan didn't. His own setup contradicted his story. The cameras in Austin's room were positioned wrong. If they were meant to monitor our son's behavioral issues, they'd be pointed at his bed, his desk, his play area. Instead, they were pointed at the doorway and the hallway beyond. Monitoring who came and went, not what Austin was doing. The recording devices were voice-activated, but set to ignore children's voices. They were calibrated to record adult conversations in specific ranges. My range, not Austin's. The equipment Nathan claimed was for parental observation was actually designed for spousal surveillance, and he documented the setup himself in those careful notes, never imagining anyone else would read them. I photographed everything. The camera angles, the equipment settings, the technical specifications. Then I called Teresa. She brought a colleague, a technology forensics expert named Omar. Together, they documented Nathan's entire surveillance network. Not just the equipment I'd found, but devices I'd never noticed. Hidden in vents, behind picture frames, inside smoke detectors. Our entire house was wired. 20. Nathan's narrative started collapsing the moment people began asking questions. I'd mentioned casually to Austin's teacher that Nathan had some concerns about our son's behavior. Mrs. Palmer looked confused. She said Austin was one of her best students, socially well-adjusted, no behavioral issues at all. She'd never expressed any concerns to Nathan. In fact, she'd only met him twice all year, briefly during pickup. I showed Dr. Holloway's notes to Teresa. She recognized the letterhead immediately. Dr. Holloway had retired 8 months ago. The practice was closed. Any recent notes bearing his signature were fabricated. Nathan had used a real psychiatrist's name to give legitimacy to fake documentation. I contacted our insurance company about claims filed under Dr. Holloway's name. They had no record of any appointments or evaluations for our family. The therapy sessions Nathan claimed we'd been attending never happened. Every piece of his carefully constructed story started falling apart under basic scrutiny. And the documentation he'd spent months creating became evidence of something far more sinister than parental concern. It showed premeditation, deception, and a disturbing willingness to falsify professional documentation for personal gain. 21. The person who changed everything was Nathan's own mother. She called me one afternoon, her voice hesitant and apologetic. She said she needed to tell me something she'd noticed over the past year. Nathan had been coaching Austin before family visits, teaching him specific phrases to use, stories to tell. His grandmother had thought it was odd but harmless at first. Children sometimes need prompting to share about their week, but the coaching had become more intense, more specific. And recently, Nathan had asked Austin to mention times when Mommy seemed sad or Mommy forgot things. Small comments designed to seem like innocent observations from a child, but his mother recognized them for what they were. Planted testimony. She kept quiet because Nathan was her son. But watching Austin become a weapon in whatever plan Nathan was executing had finally pushed her to act. She agreed to document what she'd witnessed. The coaching sessions, the planted stories, the way Nathan had been systematically using their family gatherings to build a narrative. Her testimony would be devastating, not because she was an expert or an outsider, but because she was Nathan's own mother, choosing to protect her grandson from her son. 22. When Nathan finally realized he'd lost control of the narrative, he tried to flip the script one last time. He filed for emergency custody, claiming I'd become dangerous and unstable. The court documents were filled with excerpts from his notes, twisted incidents, carefully curated evidence of my supposed deteriorating mental state. What he didn't expect was my response. Instead of defending myself emotionally, instead of reacting the way his documentation predicted, I presented facts. Court transcripts of the hearing were clinical and devastating. Omar testified about the illegal surveillance network. Teresa explained the parental alienation pattern. Mrs. Palmer confirmed there had never been behavioral concerns. The insurance company provided documentation proving Dr. Holloway's practice had been closed. Nathan's own mother testified about the coaching sessions, and I presented the notes. All of them, with timestamps and context that showed they weren't observations of concerning behavior, but documentation of a year-long campaign to manufacture evidence. The judge's expression grew colder as the evidence mounted. This wasn't a custody dispute. It was a domestic control case with falsified documentation and illegal surveillance. Nathan's case collapsed in a single afternoon. 23. The day after the hearing, Austin asked me something that broke my heart. "Mom," he said quietly, "why did Dad teach me those things to say about you?" I sat down beside him on his bed and tried to find words a 9-year-old could understand. I told him that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, that his dad had been confused about some things and thought he was helping when he wasn't. Austin was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I knew those things weren't true. I wanted to tell you, but Dad said it would upset you." My son had been carrying that burden for months, knowing he was being used to hurt me, but believing he was protecting me by staying quiet. The manipulation had been layered and sophisticated. Nathan had convinced Austin that protecting me meant following his instructions, that being a good son meant keeping secrets. I held Austin while he cried, not for the surveillance or the notes or the court case, but for the realization that someone he trusted had used him as a weapon. And I promised him something. No more secrets. No more coached answers. No more being careful about what he said. He was allowed to be a kid again. 24. The court offered Nathan a chance to respond publicly to the findings, to explain the surveillance, the falsified documentation, the parental alienation attempts. His lawyer advised him to settle quietly, to accept supervised visitation and mandatory counseling without admitting fault. Nathan wanted to fight, wanted to present his side, explain his actions, defend his year-long campaign against his own wife, but his lawyer explained the reality. Every piece of documentation Nathan had created to prove I was unfit now proved he was manipulative, controlling, and willing to commit crimes to win custody. The surveillance was illegal in our state. The falsified medical documents could result in fraud charges. The parental alienation attempts could cost him access to Austin completely. Fighting would only make it worse. In the end, Nathan took the settlement. But I declined one thing. The court asked if I wanted to make a statement for the record, to explain how his actions had affected me, to set the story straight after a year of being documented and discredited. I said no, because at that point, The truth was already clear. The evidence spoke for itself. And Nathan's silence said everything else that needed to be said. 25. 3 years have passed since I found that surveillance equipment in Austin's closet. People ask me sometimes if I feel vindicated, if winning the case felt like justice. The truth is more complicated. I wasn't overreacting when I questioned what I found. I was reacting to something real that no one else could see. Nathan had spent over a year building a reality where I was unstable, paranoid, unfit. He documented every moment, twisted every interaction, created a narrative so convincing that even I started doubting myself. The surveillance equipment wasn't the crime. It was just evidence of something much deeper. A systematic attempt to erase someone's credibility, autonomy, and truth. And the scariest part is how close it came to working. If I'd been a little more trusting, a little less observant, a little more willing to accept his explanations, I would have walked into that facility he suggested. I would have given up my son voluntarily. I would have become the unstable woman his notes claimed I was. Austin is 12 now. He's in therapy, processing what happened, learning to trust his own perceptions again. And sometimes he asks me how I knew, how I figured it out when Dad was so careful. I tell him the truth. I knew because I never stopped trusting myself, even when everything around me said I was wrong. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you in the next video.